Hello folks, welcome back to Reaper Minis TV. First thing we're going to do for this episode is give you a... Okay, so here you can see the puttied or filled in Razig army that I'm building, and I've got this spackling putty that goes on pink, and as it dries it turns white, and it just gets less pink and more white as it dries. So for these guys, it's just about dry. A little longer and it'll be completely dry, but when it's pink you can tell it's still wet, so I like it. It just gives a good visual indication of as it's drying, so I don't mess with it too early. Now I am going to do some more scraping and leveling of the putty here just to try to get it as close down to the base. But this is the base of the army, and you can tell there are some extra guys in here that weren't in the original 1,000-point army, and that's just because I have a couple other Razig guys that I might as well get painted now at the same time also. And here's the primed version of the army. I prime them in white, and I do that with just about everything, no matter what the final color is going to turn out to be. And you can just see them here ranked up. I've got all of the riflemen and the crow's nest willies that are going to be leading them. Got the cannon crew there. Captain Razig is in there, Mr. Blood is in there, a couple of Jackie Bones are in there, and they're not in the base 1,000-point list, but they'll probably make an appearance in an army here or there. I decided to leave the cannons off of bases, and I think that was primarily just to have ease of use or fitting of them on the battlefield. If they're going up a hill or something like that, the 40mm base for just the cannon might be just a little bigger than I want it to be. So next step is going to be to do the initial inking of the figures, and we'll take a look at that right now. So for these guys, for me, the initial inking is actually sort of like my first base coat of paint, and what I'm trying to do is establish the deep shadows first in the darkened areas, and then I'm going to come in over it with the bone color and the color of their clothes and things like that. So for me, it's just establishing that initial dark shadow. Now for almost everybody in this army, they're getting an initial wash of a dark flesh ink. The hag and the cannon barrels are getting a green ink because I'm going to make the cannon barrels kind of rusted and have a nice patina to them, or at least that's the hope. And the sea hag is going to end up being more of a bluish green, almost maybe sea foam kind of color, as opposed to the undead skeleton, regular skeleton colors of the rest of the army. And next time we have some Razig army updates, you should see significantly more color on all of the models, but for now, let's get to some reviews. And first up are 3 Warlord blisters, and starting off with Hania, a Ghostmane Warrior for the Korvosa faction. This is a large figure that goes on a 40mm square base. There are 2 pieces that make up the miniature. You've got pretty much 99% of the figure as cast as a single piece, and then there's a small bit of the chain that's also on the casting tab that is going to need to get clipped off and put in right behind where the figure's right fist or hand ends. So it's going to be coming out the back of the figure up at the top. There's a peg and void joint up where his hand and the bit of chain is going to fit together, and if you were just going to use it for display purposes, it would be fine. But I think it's going to be a little bit of a weak joint just from a gameplay use, so you're going to want to be careful with it and not knock it around too much. You could pin it, but it almost looks like it's too small to pin, so maybe not even that. I wouldn't pin it. I would just super glue it and be a little bit careful with it when I'm playing with it. I like the pose of the miniature. It has a sense of movement to it, like he's swinging the chain around, and you can almost imagine him unrolling or uncoiling the chain around his body to strike at distant enemies that are a little further away, so he's got to uncoil or unwrap himself out of the chain. So it reminds me a little bit of Jackie Chan in Shanghai Nights, where he had the horseshoe on the end of the rope and he was swinging it around and swinging it back around himself. So maybe just a cool sense of animation and motion to the miniature without it being all posed in crazy directions or anything like that. Next is an addition to the Kragmar faction, and this is a ram rider. This comes in 4 pieces. You get the ram, or most of the ram, and the rider, and then the head of the ram, and for the rider you have an axe and a shield that come as separate pieces. Both the ram and the rider are in heavy plate armor for the most part, but on the ram obviously you have some fur, and on the rider he's got a fur jacket on to go along with the plate that he's got on his arms and his legs and his helmet. And the pose of the ram is really nice. I like that he's rearing up, ready to strike down on top of an enemy, and then you've got the rider who's going to crash down with his axe and shield on top of the ram, smashing into you. So, very cool pose. I like the figure. I think he'd also do well outside of Warlord, maybe as a dwarven knight or cavalier if you wanted to stretch your imagination a little bit. And our last Warlord figure for this episode is a Darkshade Raider from the Dark Reach, Dark Elf faction for Warlord, and this is a single-piece miniature that, on initial look, appears to be quite flat and maybe doesn't have a whole lot of sense of motion to it. But after I looked at it for a little while and got to hold it in my hand and see it on the base, that initial thought of, this is a pretty flat, motionless figure started to go away. She is carrying two almost tomahawk-like, is the best way I can describe it, weapons, one in each hand. She has a large flowing cape like many of the other Dark Reach Dark Elves, and for me that's what helped erase the flatness or lack of motion of the figure. You can see she's leaning forward, ready to chop down, and her cloak is flowing behind her. Her robes are tattered and shredded up, and they're flowing behind her. She's got her right leg extended, like she's just running forward, ready to slam into somebody and chop into them. So for me that helped really give it a sense of motion when I first thought it was kind of flat. And my immediate use is going to be to drop her into a Dark Reach army I'm slowly building. But even before that, I think it would be a great assassin for a Dark Elf army, namely my Dark Elf army for Warhammer Fantasy Battle. We're going to jump into the Pathfinder line now for 3 figures, and the first is going to be Queen Ileosa. And this is a single-piece miniature. She did not need very much cleaning at all. It was a very crisp and clean casting. You can see she's got just a fan in her left hand and her right hand is on her hip, and to me this initially feels like much more of either an NPC kind of miniature or maybe a player character in a very heavy role-playing game where much more role-playing going on, much less combat, much more maybe investigation, but it's not a combat party kind of character, at least not in my eyes. Next is a guy named Eando, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Eando Kline, and he's billed as a Pathfinder, which I guess fits in just fine with the Pathfinder game. This is a 2-piece miniature. The second piece is the sword and scabbard. It comes as part of the casting tab. You'll need to clip it off, clean it up a little bit, and then attach it onto his belt. But to me, this guy kind of strikes me as an everyman kind of hero. A commoner who gets thrust into, whether it's Pathfinder, D&D, Warhammer Fantasy, Roleplay, whatever game, he kind of gets thrust into everything that's going on around him. So he's a peasant hero maybe, or a guy off the farm who now is like, why am I wandering around these dungeons and what the heck is going on? He's wearing lots of leather armor, has extra pouches and a backpack, and looks like a bunch of adventuring gear, probably everything he carried with him when he left to go find fame and fortune or whatever he got thrust into. And while he's not in a big, combat pose or anything like that, I just like the miniature. I think he looks kind of cool. Here we have Shalely, an elf ranger, female figure, single-piece miniature, and the first thing that you probably notice on her is her very stylized kind of hair that's going off in all directions. She also has rather large, pointed ears that are sticking out from her hair or from her head, and these are sort of like the World of Warcraft big floppy, almost rabbit ear kind of elf ears. I like them a lot. I have nothing against them whatsoever. I think they just make the figure stand out a little bit more. She's also wearing mostly leather armor with her long cloak. She's drawing an arrow out of a quiver, ready to shoot it at somebody. A fairly relaxed pose, but as an elf ranger like she's designed to be, she'd be fine in an RPG as a player character. I think you could probably drop her in as the leader of a unit of Glade Guard for a Wood Elf army for Warhammer Fantasy, or even as a Wood Elf player character in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And the last thing for me to show you for this episode isn't really a review, but a preview of the Owlbear that I showed you when we took a look at the Savage North rulebook. Here's a look at the green of the Owlbear that is going to be put into production soon. So very tempting for me to look at building a Wood Elf army for Warlord. And also for D&D players, an Owlbear is sort of a staple for Dungeons & Dragons, but I'm sure you could use it in other games also. I could probably field it as some kind of Tzeentchian spawn in a Warhammer Fantasy Battle army or something like that. Okay, everybody, thanks for watching this episode of Reaper Minis TV. In the first episode for December, which will be the next episode that comes out, is when we're going to have our Christmas giveaway. It's going to be a pre-Christmas giveaway, so go ahead and subscribe now to have a chance of winning a Reaper gift certificate.